I lived completely isolated for almost a year and never knew. I spent most of my 20s in the construction industry before the accident that would change my life. Even though my parents wished I would go to engineering school, I never had the head for it. Truthfully, I always preferred the tactile challenge of laboring with my hands. Projects came and went, and though contracts expired periodically, I was never out of work for long. I always found another site to build or oversee. So naturally, when the Whitlam Hawthorne Group approached me with an offer to be the foreman on their upcoming headquarters construction, I jumped at the opportunity. Having a reputable corporation behind me, with job security and a salary that exceeded my wildest hopes, sounded ideal. Who could say no? Unfortunately, the foundation wasn't even fully set by the time disaster struck. People argued over the real cause: surveyors, engineers, or sheer unpredictable misfortune. But those of us who ended up trapped under the collapsing structure fixed our ire on the company that employed us. 3 lives lost, 13 people injured, and an avalanche of potential legal trouble was enough for Whitlam Hawthorne to propose a sizable settlement, hoping to avoid drawn-out litigation. Call me a sellout all you want, but if you saw as many zeros on a check as I did, your silence would probably be bought too. Moreover, they gave me a systems position I could do remotely, along with a discount on rent in one of their apartment communities. They guaranteed it would be fully accessible for the wheelchair I now needed indefinitely. Before then, I had no clue they owned any housing at all, but they mailed me a glossy brochure that showed a modern, well-maintained complex. With my new reality in mind, it was obvious I couldn't stay alone on the 4th floor of my old building anymore. I settled in sometime in early February. To be honest, it rattled me more than I ever imagined. One day I was outside daily, covered in dust and sweat, and the next I was stuck inside, grappling with a wheelchair and learning how to use it, feeling caged. My routine switched from hard hat and steel-toed boots to a laptop computer and a filing cabinet. If I'm honest, the bleak mood that set in only deepened once I'd officially moved. Moving day itself felt ridiculously short, because I didn't own much that still made sense with my new constraints. Within a single day, still wearing hospital bands, I was more or less completely moved into my new home. The apartment, for obvious reasons, was on the ground floor. Above me rose 2 more levels of units, each with a patio that stuck out over the small, fenced-off patch of lawn in front of my own sliding door. Light already struggled to reach my living room window, and that overhang turned the place that much darker. Off to one side was the kitchen, kitted out with lowered counters and easy-to-reach cabinets. My bedroom was reasonably large, and the bathroom had an accessible layout. I wish I could say I was grateful, but the fact that I needed all these features reminded me at every turn that my old life was gone. Let me clarify something. I don't see disability as a sign of lesser worth. My aunt used a wheelchair for as long as I can remember, and my older brother had unique challenges of his own. I've always treated them with the respect they deserved. But both of them died, and in both cases, they faced needs that no one around them stepped up to address. My aunt, in her final days, toppled out of her chair and lacked the strength to get up or even dial for help. By the time medics arrived, her pets had reportedly begun to bite her before she passed. My brother ended up taking his own life because our parents refused to get him the help his situation demanded. I cut ties with my family shortly thereafter and never looked back. So, after nearly 3 decades of being self-reliant and capable, it felt like everything I'd worked for was ripped away. There I was, wholly reliant on the same company that created my predicament. Unsurprisingly, bitterness settled in deeply. That June, the heat felt record-breaking in my state. I'd by then adapted to a mundane rhythm. I woke up, powered through some arm exercises, showered, ate breakfast, and puttered around with my so-called job. Truth be told, the tasks they assigned me felt more like busy work. Anything to justify my name on their payroll, to keep me under NDA and away from potential lawsuits. By lunchtime, I'd check what groceries I was short on, updating my weekly delivery list. It was a no-brainer to have someone else drop off groceries rather than trying to navigate a supermarket alone. I'd basically arranged my life so I never had to leave my place. I was in no mood for conversation or human contact, so staying in came easily. For months, the only voices I heard were those of my neighbors. Based on the yelling overhead, a married couple lived above me who never seemed to stop fighting. And in the adjacent unit, I frequently overheard an elderly lady who apparently housed more felines than the lease allowed. One particularly scorching morning in mid-June, fresh out of the shower, the power in my apartment abruptly died. With everyone's AC running around the clock, I guess it was inevitable. I dried off, and for the first time since I'd arrived, opened the drapes to wheel out through the sliding door, heading into the minuscule yard where the breaker box was installed. The thick, hot air enveloped me. I looked down at my feet, touching the grass, though I couldn't feel it, and realized that absent the constant hum of outdoor AC units, the world was still and silent. Not even the chirp of an insect or bird. For a fleeting moment, I savored the sunlight on my face, just before the shadow from the balcony above stole it away. It felt like pure, blissful calm, if only for those few seconds. That abrupt calm shattered when I heard a sliding door open above, the creak of the wooden deck, followed by the recognizable voices in mid-argument. "If you're not going to fix it, then I will." That was the wife, sounding both exasperated and determined. "I never said I wouldn't do it. I said to give me a damn minute to get my shoes on. Why do you always—" I tried to block them out. My instant of serenity had been all too brief, but I had to restore power, so I opened the fuse box and flipped the breakers. Outside, I heard my AC cough back to life, flooding the space with its familiar mechanical whine. At least that noise drowned out the bickering above. I wrestled with the raised lip in the doorway, trying to maneuver my wheelchair back inside. As I finally made it over the threshold, I realized the couple had quieted. Their door slid shut with a thump, sealing out their fight for the moment. Frankly, I was relieved. I hoped I wouldn't need to go outside again for a long while. Shamefully, I can admit now that I didn't set foot, or wheel rather, outside again for months. My family and I had cut ties years ago, and the few friends I had were in other states. With summer raging and my own mood in shambles, I stayed in without regret. My days reduced to a pattern: wake up, shower, breakfast, idly stare at my computer screen, sleep, repeat. The arguing above me, the occasional whine of a cat next door. All of it blurred into the same dull background noise. Sometimes I almost managed to tune it out altogether. Other times, I ended up listening more closely than I intended, purely out of lack of any other company. I discovered a few details. The woman upstairs, Claire, rarely seemed to leave the apartment, and she only really spoke to criticize or scold her husband, whose name might have been Jackson or Jason. He sounded perpetually on edge, maybe with a temper problem, but often just defensive more than outright aggressive. Together, they were like the worst combination of cold cynicism and irritability. Next door, the cat lady was a mystery. I never caught her name, but I picked up her cats' names pretty quickly: Tom, Greta, and Priscilla. Later, there might have been another cat or two. Listening to her coax and reprimand them became my unintentional hobby. Sometimes I'd catch her scolding Tom for meowing too loudly for food, or yelling at Greta and Priscilla for squabbling over a particular sunlit spot on the floor. I found myself daydreaming about having a sun-drenched room myself. That was something I desperately missed. I realized, sometime around mid-September, that the voices I heard daily were my sole connection to other human beings. One day, I tried clearing my throat and was startled by how alien my own voice sounded. I broke down in tears before bed that night, recognizing how alone I truly felt. By October, my solitude was choking me. Oddly enough, I started paying more attention to every argument, every meow, even leaning in to hear muffled phrases through the walls. As bizarre as it was, these voices were my only comfort. Eventually, something in me snapped, and I started quietly replying to them. It was nothing dramatic, just hushed answers. If I heard Claire hiss, "You never listen to me," I'd whisper, "I'm listening." If her husband muttered, "God, I can't do this," I would softly respond, "Me neither." Yes, it felt pathetic, but it was the only way I could remind myself I was still capable of speech, still human. In some desperate sense, it made me feel like I was part of the conversation. Over time, I made a nightly ritual of it. In the low glow of my desk lamp, maybe with a whiskey or beer in hand, I'd just listen. Their spats, the cat calls, the random small talk. When Claire snapped, "You don't take me seriously anymore," I'd reply in a barely audible murmur, "I do, though." If the older woman next door growled at Tom for toppling something, I'd grin and whisper, "Bad kitty." It was odd, but it became my substitute for real companionship. But then, about a week into this new habit, I noticed something that sent chills through me. Claire shouted, "For once in your life, admit that I could be right." My own automatic retort was, "Why should I when you're wrong?" Not even a second later, I heard her husband above echo back to her, "But why should I when you're wrong?" I froze, my heart pounding. It almost seemed like he'd parroted my very words. But maybe I had heard that fight before? God knows they repeated themselves enough times. It was enough to rattle me, though. Soon after, she yelled something about being overdue on her car registration. Exactly the same words I recalled hearing months ago, right down to the intonation. There was no way it was truly overdue now if it had been up for renewal so long before. Was I losing my mind, or were they actually repeating everything word for word? I tried to write it off as the cyclical nature of arguments. People in constant conflict often rehash the same points. But something nagged at me. I laid awake that night, ears tuned to the ceiling, sensing an undercurrent of strangeness. The following day, I decided to meticulously record every conversation I could make out. Usually, I half-listened, but this time I turned off every fan, paused my laundry cycle, refrained from using the shower, anything to keep my home silent enough to pick up every note from next door or above. At exactly 8:15 a.m., I caught the old woman scolding her cat Tom. "I fed you already." At 8:17, Claire was on the phone. "He left for work. Yes, I'll be here alone until he comes back for lunch." At 12:32, I heard Claire snap at her husband for slamming the front door. By bedtime, I had a thorough log of their chatter. Then the next morning came, and it was eerie. Everything played out again at the exact same time, with the exact same words. Tom was told to be quiet at 8:15. Claire was on the phone at 8:17, complaining about the same details. By 12:32, the same scolding about the door echoed through the ceiling, despite me never actually hearing any door slam. The repetition made my stomach twist. Realizing that the entire building seemed stuck on some bizarre loop, I decided to step outside for a breath of real air, something I hadn't done in ages. I wheeled myself into the courtyard, feeling the bright sunlight glare in my eyes. The building arced in a large U-shape around me, and a mirror image building stood across the parking lot. The second and third floor balconies looked stacked on one another like concrete boxes. Peering upward, I saw the blinds in the couple's unit wide open, yet I couldn't detect any actual movement inside. Then I checked the unit next to mine. Same story, blinds open, stillness within. And soon I realized that every single apartment in sight was just as empty looking. I waited for nearly an hour, desperate to catch the slightest flicker of movement in a window or hear a door open. Nothing. The hush pressed in on me, making me realize, for the first time, that I'd never seen any of these neighbors in the flesh. Not once had we passed in the parking lot, or run into each other taking out the trash, or even arrived home at the same time. How had it taken me this long to notice? A wave of nausea overcame me. Then, in quick succession, the blinds in the adjacent units slid shut. Next, the couple's blinds above clapped closed. It happened in a domino effect, until every open window covering throughout the complex was sealed tight. Panicking, I rushed back inside, needing to find an office or staff who could explain this phenomenon. I exited the courtyard into the lot, scanning for a management sign. The entire community stretched on in endless repetition, building after identical building, each with blinds now closed and no signs of life. I saw lifeless cars, children's toys on sidewalks, bicycles leaning abandoned, but not one human being. I spent maybe 20 minutes looking, arms burning from the unaccustomed exercise, before finally giving up and returning to my unit. The windows outside were all blocked, giving a dreary, deserted quality to what had briefly been my home. My breath caught in my throat, grappling with the fact that I might truly be alone here. The moment I shut my front door, I heard the doorbell ring. Heart hammering, I yanked it open again. Nobody was there. Yet my scheduled grocery order was right at my feet. Somehow, it had appeared in the short second I'd taken to close and reopen the door. I felt chills, suspecting I was caught in some elaborate illusion. The next few days blurred by in a haze of confusion. I found myself peeking out windows constantly, sure that if anyone looked inside, I'd resemble a paranoid wreck. And for about a week, all the usual background noise, the arguments, the cat fussing, the phone calls, just ceased. It was as if whatever was orchestrating these false neighbors realized I was onto the pattern and paused to recalibrate. Then, like clockwork, the voices came back a week later. Initially, they shifted to new arguments, different meowing intervals, subtle changes to keep the script from repeating verbatim day to day. I started to wonder if I'd somehow hallucinated it all. Maybe I'd been under too much stress? But on the 8th day, the loop returned full circle. Lines I'd heard a week ago reappeared precisely, each phrase repeated. The next day followed suit. The pattern had evolved from a daily loop to a weekly one, but it was still a cycle. I even heard the same driverless cars rumble by at the designated moments from my notes. I needed to know if I could break this routine, so I devised a plan. According to my logs, at 9 hours 13 minutes and 3 seconds, the old woman next door always berated her cats for supposedly bullying a new kitten. That morning, I would knock on her door at 9:13 exactly, interrupting the predetermined script to see how it adapted. Sure enough, the next day I got myself ready and stationed at her door, heart pounding, eyes on my watch. The instant 9:13 rolled around, I rapped loudly. I stopped knocking before 3 seconds could pass, precisely the span in which she'd normally start scolding her cats. For a while, there was silence. Finally, a distorted voice asked, "Who is it?" It sounded almost patchwork together from various recordings. My pulse surged. Steeling myself, I answered, "I'm your neighbor from next door." But the voice responded again in the same shaky, inhuman manner. "Who is it?" Then the door began to open. My breath locked in my throat. I half expected a monstrous figure to leap at me, but what lay beyond the threshold was simply a dark, unlit interior, as though no occupant existed. Yet something was there, speaking with that mismatched voice, trying to appear normal. I wheeled myself inside just a fraction, crossing into an uncanny coldness that seemed to radiate from the living room. A wave of absolute loneliness flooded my chest, heavier than anything I'd felt in my months alone. And in that living room, I saw a single upended wheelchair on the floor. Around it came soft, wet chewing noises, punctuated by an occasional cat's hiss or meow. The unseen gnawing made my stomach churn in horror, and I fled. Following this disturbing encounter, the pattern in my building became even more erratic. Entirely new fights or cat dramas would crop up on days I thought I had pinned down, while some days, nothing happened at all. It was like the system was reacting to my meddling. Alone and unsure, I took stock of my circumstances. My few acquaintances were scattered, and I had no close family. Meanwhile, Whitlam Hawthorne had me on payroll, but didn't truly require my presence. The question hammered at my mind. Where am I? And how did I get here so seamlessly? Flashes of memory returned. The hospital bed after the accident, then suits from the company presenting me with hush money and an apartment pamphlet. I signed the lease online while still in the hospital. Then I was driven straight to the new place. It all happened so fast. Had I overlooked all sense of caution in my traumatized state? A loud knock interrupted my spiraling thoughts. 3 forceful raps on my front door. Grabbing a kitchen knife for protection, I slowly made my way over. My voice trembled. "Who's there?" Seconds passed in silence. Then I heard my own voice, pieced together with unnatural precision, respond from the other side. I'm your neighbor, from next door." I flung the door open, brandishing the knife, but saw nothing. Just the faint sense that something occupied the space in front of me. My own voice sounded again, close enough that I could have sworn it was a reflection of my breath. "I'm your neighbor, from next door." That's when I caught a glimmer in the air. A ripple that shaped itself like a person. Horrified, I realized it was moving inside, crossing the threshold. Whatever it was, this was my moment. I hurled the knife with every ounce of strength I had. As it moved through the transparent figure, I realized I could move through it too. Summoning my courage, I pushed myself and my wheelchair forward into the frigid emptiness that was the no one. The intense cold almost paralyzed me, and the sense of bone-deep loneliness it carried felt like it could strangle my soul. But I pressed on, refusing to let it consume me. Breaking through it, I hurled myself around a corner, out into the complex grounds. What I witnessed then was an entire landscape of illusions. Other shimmering outlines emerging from doorways, from vacant cars, from the sidewalk. All of them moved in my direction, forming an intangible but oppressive crowd. Yet it seemed like they couldn't physically hold me back. They brushed past me like a freezing wind. Their voices rose in a cacophony of broken phrases, half-formed sentences, garbled meows, and squealing static. Although my arms burned more fiercely than they ever had, I propelled myself forward, ignoring the cold claws that grazed through my body. Eventually, I spotted the edge of the property. No wall, no barrier, just a subtle boundary marking the end of the complex. My heart thundered with determination, adrenaline flooding my system as I pushed across it. Instantly, the screeching chaos behind me fell silent. The air felt different, solid, real, and not suffused with that bitter emptiness. Still, I didn't dare look back right away. I heard normal city sounds. A car engine, a jogger panting. My eyes lit up with tears at the sight of a worn-down Dollar General across the street, and I nearly sobbed at the presence of a real human being jogging by. Gratefully, I wheeled into a bus stop, panting, tears of relief streaming down my face. A scruffy man on the bench eyed me warily, but I didn't care. I'd never been so happy to see another living, breathing person. After regaining some composure, I turned around to face the direction I'd come, bracing for what sort of warped structure I might see. To my absolute confusion, all that greeted me was a modest, fenced-in dirt lot, about the size of a football field. Rusty, neglected construction machines sat silent. A lone porta-potty knocked on its side. A simple chain-link fence encircled the entire area. Near the entrance stood a freshly installed development sign, bright red letters proclaiming, "Coming soon, Whitlam Hawthorne Research Complex." The same giant corporation whose job site left me in a wheelchair. But no apartment complex stood behind that fence. Just an empty plot waiting to be built on. I stared for what felt like hours, trying to reconcile what I had just escaped from. I still can't fully explain it, and perhaps I never will. All I know is that I got out. And whatever Whitlam Hawthorne is actually constructing here, I want no part of it.